I'm Lori Wisen, and I've got Dr. Emmons, Culbert, and Prasek here, and we are digging into social media and mental health with everyone today. Before we dive in, we're kind of light on time, so we won't be able to do a Q&A, but feel free to post any of your comments or questions in the chat. We're going to follow up with an email to you all with the resources we're talking about and this recording, and we'll try to answer all your questions there as well. So to begin, you may have heard about the whistleblower from Facebook who revealed that the company knew that their algorithm, especially for Instagram, was bad for public health, particularly adolescent mental health. And so I'm going to pass this over to Aimee to talk a little bit more about that news and some other research about social media and why that really matters to our mental health. Go ahead, Aimee.
Yeah, thanks, Lori. So this Facebook Instagram report, this big news, isn't really saying much new. The outside research has really been hinting toward the same thing, but this internal report is more accurate. And so there's sort of a story around that. Outside researchers really can't get behind the Facebook curtain, obviously. So a lot of the research available has been limited to self-reported time on social media to really assess associations or impact on just a single person. And so there's two main sort of common findings from this outside research that I think are helpful to know. The first is that there seems to be something to this Goldilocks hypothesis with social media and mental health for adolescents, particularly adolescent girls. I think Tim will maybe talk a little bit more about this. So the idea here with this Goldilocks hypothesis is that there's like a just right amount between no or low use and high use. And that just right amount seems to be about 30 to 60 minutes. There's like a lot of layers to talk about there. Maybe Tim will touch on that, but I'm going to move on here. Interestingly, this doesn't seem to be the case for adults. So I also have some ideas why here, but it's pretty much a case that more time on social media is associated with more depression, more anxiety, and more feelings of social isolation for adults. All right, so that's like a blunt, big picture here. And I think there are two more things that are going to be helpful to know before we dive in a bit more here. The first is that these internal reports and some recent outside research that sort of has some better data collection or more sophisticated data collection are revealing that time on the platform is like not the whole story. And perhaps the more impactful thing to look at is actually our emotional connection or relationship with the platform. So, do you feel anxious or have FOMO when you're off the platform? Do you obsess over the likes or the follows? And those metrics really kind of influence your emotional landscape. Now, here's the sort of big problem with that idea. These platforms build their algorithms to influence that emotional connection. And outside research really can't capture that proprietary algorithms, those strategies, those variables to understand which people are being targeted and how they're being targeted by the platform. And the second thing I think is really important to know is that social media use was nearly non-existent 15 years ago. So for adults in 2005, Pew Research had sort of started to gather the adoption of social media. In 2005, 5% of US adults were using one platform or at least one platform. Today, 72% of US adults are using at least one platform. So that growth, that like astronomical growth of something that we consume is important, right? We're just learning the impacts, the short term, the long term, the individual level impacts, the community level impacts. So I'm not trying to scare everyone. I believe social media has value, but I hope this helps ground our conversation so that we can start to dive in some more.
Wow, that's really interesting statistics because most of us are on social media, of course, so this really does relate to every one of us. We want to focus in on a few areas here to get better understanding of some of these concerns and how we can use social media in a more mindful and healthy way. So here's the first area we're going to dig into. And Tim, I'm hoping you can help us with this. What is the impact of social media and self-image?
Well, that's a great question. I will step back for just a moment and also just mention in general, there is really I would say, evolving research that's really solid that does suggest that, from a public health standpoint, if we look at medical, neurological, psychological, and even social consequences of the use of any kind of media, not just social media, excessive and or addictive use, really does lead to longer term mental health and physical health consequences. So I think, in general, we have to be really mindful and careful about all sorts of media, not just social media per se. By the way, surveys do indicate that about 90% of US teens have utilized or sampled some kind of social media, and more than 50% state that they use it pretty often or frequently. In general, what we know right now is that about that teens spend about 9 hours of time in general on screens during the day, and younger kids ages 8 to 12 spend about 5 or 6 hours on screens each day, and that's probably in addition to time that they spend at school on some type of computer or other device as well. In terms of the issues of body image, we do know that in general, digital media tends to present us with what some have called a distorted reality. It's not an accurate reality, compared to our real lives. And this is really important in a lot of ways. In terms of body image, to start with, we oftentimes will see these carefully, I'd say, curated or created images of perfect people on a computer screen, unrealistically thin or athletic or muscular or whatever, well-dressed, etc. And I think this is really important to understand for teenagers as well, that this is not reality. And the problem is that these kids tend to always compare themselves to these role models, if you will, or influencers on social media, and then they can feel inadequate, and ultimately they fear that they will be rejected by their own peers, and that sets up a difficult situation. I think the second issue in this distorted reality, if you will, is risk-taking. Risk-taking in terms of sex, alcohol, drugs, driving your car fast, doing other, let's say, dangerous things is kind of glorified and made to look glamorous without, I think, enough concern about realistically in real life, what the consequences might be. And then another issue in this distorted reality is definitely violence. We do know that, violence that is committed by characters like in movies, for example, that are celebrity role models for kids, can really influence things and the way teenagers think about violence. We also know that repeatedly watching, for example, violent video games has been shown to make kids in real life then engage in more violent and aggressive behavior. So we, again, have to be really careful about this. And then a final area of interest is stereotypes. Oftentimes when people see different ethnic groups or various populations on TV and media or on social media, they get an unrealistic, stereotypical sometimes view of that particular group. And this can, I think, eventually foster negative attitudes and or expectations about certain groups that are maybe unrealistic or, too generalized. And so, again, I think it's important to talk to our teens about how does that compare, what they experience in real life with people that have differences, that they are aware of in their own life, and really try to ground them in what's real and what's, being portrayed in the media.
Yeah, I think it also helps, at least for me, to wrap my head around these social or these health outcomes is to understand sort of the business models for these companies. And I'm seeing in the chat some great links to some documentaries and a conversation with Mark Zuckerberg. Anyway, that gets into a little bit more about these business models. So thank you for sharing that. Right. So I think it's important to know that these social platforms are advertising platforms. And that was like a big shift that happened in the last 5 to 10 years when they were looking to monetize these platforms. And so they're following that good old usual advertising model that was created about 100 years ago, during like a 3 martini lunch with a bunch of guys, that essentially is this: you pinpoint a problem, you amplify anxiety around that problem, and then you sell the cure. And I think all of us know how this works with, as Tim was talking about, sort of these glossy, photoshopped images. But, we know that in like fashion or health magazines, that's familiar. And we've had conversations around the impact of that, right? That media makes us like generally feel terrible about ourselves. And then they try to sell us something. It's that advertising model. Again, pinpoint a problem, use fear, shame, or guilt, amplify anxiety, and sell the cure. So these social media platforms are doing the same thing. They're fostering and hijacking that emotional connection I referenced earlier to tailor their advertising. And here's this like super important difference that I think is essential that we understand. They know so much about us that they leverage that data to tailor these advertising strategies, right? They tailor the shame, they tailor the guilt, they tailor the fear in ways that more easily trigger us. Adolescents, adults, it doesn't matter. And then they, of course, tailor the sell, either to get us to stay on the platform longer or to click that link that somebody paid to show us.
Oh my, that's some really, really good information. Thanks, Tim and Aimee, about that. We're going to move on a little bit. Another area that we want to dive into is social media's impact on relationships and connections. Tim, do you want to explain a little bit more of how that relates to kids?
Sure. It's amazing to me in my clinical practice. I'm a developmental and behavioral pediatrician. How many kids, when I ask them about, what have they been doing with their friends lately? Are they hanging out with friends or having some fun that way? Many will respond, yes, absolutely. They're seeing their friends a lot. But when I really dig deeper with them, what's happening is they're seeing their friends mostly online, for example, playing video games online with friends and then using the chat function to interact. And I think what the kids are totally not understanding is how different that is, from real in-person, what we call offline social interactions or communications. So it's no doubt that the coronavirus, pandemic really changed the way we interact with each other. The social distancing, online, friendships and communications and interactions, have really become the norm. But I'm concerned about that in that I do think we have a whole generation now, kids that are kind of developing socially and emotionally with this online influence that concerns me. We know that when we have a real in-person or offline interaction, we utilize all 5 of our senses, certainly at least 4 of them, and I think what's concerning about online interactions is that there's so much information that we don't get as part of that online experience. What people talk mostly about is the big things have to do with social cues and nonverbal cues and body language, for example. So observing someone online it's much more difficult to get some of those nuances in that situation online than it is when you're in person. Add in other things, like body postures, the distance between people in a real live interaction, and some of these other factors. And what experts are saying is that online interactions don't teach us as much, and we don't develop as much emotional intelligence with these online interactions as we do when we are communicating with somebody in person in the real world. And I think that that's going to be a real problem going forward, in that kids just don't have the well-developed social skills because of this than they compared to their peers that are maybe interacting more often in person. And we'll see how this plays out. But, I think the bottom line is kids don't understand it yet. What phenomena that we are seeing is that even kids that have a lot of online social interactions, so they feel like they're in some ways socially successful, they're describing that they still feel socially isolated. And that's because what the experts say, these online interactions are much less satisfying, emotionally speaking.
Mm.
Yeah, so I think maybe this helps me, Tim, what you're saying. It's not as satisfying. So I kind of want to like dig into the evolutionary needs around this. Like we are wired to connect, right? And social media plays on that need. Just like Tim was saying, we want to grow our social networks online. We want to be more connected, but we are wired, from an evolutionary perspective, we are wired to connect in ways that build trust and that include nurturing and helping behaviors. And that's what's so interesting, I think, about social media, as you just touched on, this irony that folks who use social more generally feel more socially isolated. And I think, one reason here is, as I said, we expand our circles so big, but we rarely foster any relationships there. We're not cultivating those pro-social behaviors, right? But all of this energy goes out. Like, I have to see your posts. I see your struggles that, bruise up a stress response for me. I see your glossy perfection, perhaps, but I don't really know you. So it can be hard to reach out, right, with a sincere act of care or a helping behavior like we're wired to do, or with those glossy pictures to actually know you well enough to understand that, like, oh, your life isn't so glossy. Maybe I'm not failing here. Maybe there's not this big lesson or secret or skill that I lack. Maybe our lives are all kind of messy. So like we really never resolve these needs for meaningful connection, or rarely do on these platforms. And there's some interesting research here as well, I think, that relates with the idea that folks who keep their social networks really small and intimate with trusting people in that circle, there can be a lot of great benefits there. And in those situations, right, those platforms actually help to foster those deep connections and help people to stay connected. So there's hope.
Yay. Well, let's dig in a little bit more into that wiring. So Tim and Henry, can you explain more to us about how social media actually affects the brain?
There's a couple of things that have come up recently that on that topic that I did want to point out. Actually, I'm glad that you asked. Many parents, I think, have this feeling overall that video gaming in particular, but any kind of screen use might be driving the child's difficulties with attention span and distraction in general, and can certainly, I'd say, potentially contribute to things like not getting your homework done or not getting your chores done at home. So we do know that there is such a thing as digital media overload, where when we consume too much information from all these electronic sources, our brain kind of gets fried out, and it can increase issues like anxiety and depression and feelings of stress, as well as, I'd say, general distraction and confusion. But the issue of ADHD has been really fascinating, in particular because there's been a lot of concerns that maybe in this digital age, kids that are utilizing a lot of electronic media, in particular video games, we might be entraining a short attention span, and they get used to that, and that's all they want. So I think what the research currently shows is a bit confusing, in that I will say this: the experts agree that there's no definitive evidence that video gaming, in particular excessive video gaming, causes ADHD. However, there are studies that show correlations between excessive, or at least intensive, media use, screen use, and video gaming, and the later development of attentional challenges in kids. So I think the jury is not yet in on that issue, but I think, a couple of studies highlight this. A recent study in 2021 in Brazil showed that when they look at people with a diagnosis of ADHD by the time that they're a young adult, by the age of 22 years old, they look back at their life histories, and they did show that the diagnosis of ADHD at 22 years of age was correlated with how much time these people spent on electronic media of all kinds at ages 11, 18, and 15 years. And so there was, a very clear correlation in that study. Another interesting study in pediatrics just a couple of years ago showed that when they followed a group of kids, teenagers, who did not have a diagnosis of ADHD, but they started following them at ages 15 years and 16 years, over the next 2 years, the amount of electronic media that they utilized or consumed predicted the kids that would later on, then beyond the age of 16, go on to develop or at least experience much more in the way of symptoms of ADHD. So it did seem like media use was driving the ADHD symptoms in that group. So I think, the bottom line is that we don't know quite yet. Now, here's another twist in the story. On the upside, recent studies have shown that video gameplay can actually enhance things like visual, spatial skills, eye-hand coordination, and even attention. So there's a new technology out there from this company, Endeavor RX, that's FDA approved, that uses video games to actually entrain attention and decrease impulsivity in kids. So it's hard to know what the future holds, but that's, I think, some interesting findings.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the things that Aimee was referring to earlier, and I heard the whistleblower say something like this as well, that Facebook makes its profit in part by keeping attention on its platform.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's probably true for all the social media platforms. But how does it keep your attention? I think it does that through the dopamine system. And that's something that's probably worth us exploring a little bit. So dopamine, you may know, is one of the primary brain chemicals related to mood. Very important mood chemical, but it's also perhaps the most important way that the brain has of experiencing pleasure. So dopamine really is the pleasure chemical. And that is one of the reasons why it is so tied to all forms of addiction. And I think we can agree, and I think the research is showing this, that there's a very addictive quality to how many of us engage with social media, or really with technology generally. And I am guilty of this myself, so I know firsthand what I'm talking about. There is this desire to keep clicking, to keep getting more, to get something that gives you this immediate sense of satisfaction, pleasure, resolution, and then you want to do it again and again. And, it's built into our bodies, into our brains for a reason, but we're not built to be getting this dopamine hit every few seconds or every few minutes or whatever it is. It just throws the brain and the body into some disarray. There's also, the dopamine is also very tightly wound up in the motivation system. And so when the dopamine system gets off, it's much harder for people to stay really engaged and motivated in their world beyond that addictive aspect of it. And then as Tim was alluding to, the dopamine system is also very important as a part of maintaining our focus. And so when ADHD symptoms get kicked into gear, that's one of the big reasons why. Now, there's also this aspect that I think Aimee alluded to as well, that content that gets a stronger emotional reaction is much more likely to be clicked open and shared. So there's also this very conscious intent through the algorithms to make you mad or make you sad or make you feel some strong emotion, because that's what's going to be clicked and shared. So there's this economic benefit in keeping your stress system in sort of a high activity range. And so what a lot of this does in terms of our brain function is that it becomes overactivating. We get these brain circuits going, faster and more robustly, and they just kind of, these thoughts and these impulses keep circulating, which makes it hard for the brain to slow down and to go into rest mode, which has a crucial effect on sleep. And sleep, is really one of the most important factors in sustaining mood and, healthy behaviors during the day and healthy focus during the day. So there's all these things get tied together in a very insidious sort of way.
Wow, that's great. So Henry, that leads us to actually the bigger question: what does social media do to our mood?
Well, I think we've been hearing throughout our time together that there are all of these different pathways into our brains and our bodies by which social media can have a negative impact on our mood. So self-image and self-esteem, particularly in the teen years, but Tim and I are not immune to this either, and Aimee and maybe Lori too. So, at any age, self-image and self-esteem have such a huge impact on how we feel emotionally. There's this element of envy that gets activated, comparing ourselves to others. There's the sense of disconnection and social isolation that Tim talked about is one of the most important contributing factors to depression. I think that a lot of this gets mediated through dopamine overactivation and later dopamine depletion and also sleep disruption. So if you wanted to create a recipe for depression, this is a really, really powerful way to start.
Yeah. All right, you guys, we want to end this with some really tangible things that our listeners can do to use social media in more helpful and mindful ways. So Tim, Henry, and Aimee, what is the one suggestion you have, the golden nugget, so to speak, or the most bang for your buck idea to kind of help folks with social media use?
I would say, if parents are really concerned about this, there's a great option on the American Academy of Pediatrics website called healthychildren.org, called the Family Media Use Plan, that all families can go to this website and fill out together with your kids, mom and dad there as well, a family media use plan where you really determine as a family, for all members of the family, who's going to use what media, how long are they going to use it for, for what purposes and at what times of day. As you'll see also on that website, the healthychildren.org, there's a lot of other great media tips for supporting parents and supervising the use of media by their kids. I like this mnemonic device they've come up with called TECH, TECH parenting. T stands for talk to your children about media use and don't avoid the subject. E is for educating them about the risks and the benefits of media use. C is for co-viewing. This is a big one. Make sure you watch the video games on the social media platforms with your kids together. And then finally, H is for house rules. Establish those house rules for media use for everybody.
So I'm going to go with sleep, in part because I've come to see sleep as the absolute linchpin for maintaining good mental health. And I think there's a lot of things about our interaction with social media that impacts our sleep. This is actually a pretty big topic. So, if you want more information, go to our website. We have all kinds of resources on sleep. And I'm just going to say this, that if you're not sleeping well or your child is not sleeping well, do not stop learning about it and trying to make some changes until sleep is really more normal. One other last thing I'll say is I think it's in the best interest of all of us just not to have any electronic devices that we can interact with in our bedrooms. I finally had to take my cell phone out of my bedroom because at 3 a.m, my judgment's not quite as good as it is at other times in the day. And so I just think we just need to move it somewhere else where you can't even find it.
Mm-hmm.
So this might sound extreme, but I really like to think of social media as alcohol. And recently, Derek Thompson, I think it was Derek Thompson, wrote an article in The Atlantic about this. And there's been researchers that have sort of tried to play around with this metaphor as well. It's a bit controversial, mainly because the execs in big tech want to fight against it, but I actually think it's very spot on. And well, here it is. The idea here is that social media is something that we consume, right? And in small amounts, as we've talked about today, and for most people, it can be just fine. In fact, it can be helpful for some. However, it's generally a depressant. It is addictive. And when it's used too much, it can have severe negative effects individually and on a community level. And some people really just should not use it because they can't control their use, or it just, generally makes them feel like garbage, which is kind of where I sit oftentimes with social media consumption. Mm-hmm. So with that sort of metaphor, if it resonates with you, and I'll kind of pull the string from Tim and Henry too, with putting controls around your media use, I encourage you to put limits on your use, like you would for alcohol, like no cocktails before 5, and don't take a cocktail to bed because it will absolutely impact your sleep in a negative way.
That's really amazing. I actually have an app on my phone that sets a timer of how much social media use you're actually using for the day, and it'll cut you off, which is really great.
Yeah, get cut off.
Yeah, it was super. Those are great suggestions, all of you. I want to thank Henry, Tim, and Aimee for this wonderful discussion, a well-needed discussion, and thank everybody else for being here with us. You can head over to naturalmentalhealth.com for more resources on this topic, and we have other tools there to support your mental health more naturally. So with that, we'll say goodbye. Thank you all.